This session is called How Accessible is My Website? And that might be a question that you find yourself asking. This may be a question that other folks are asking you. My name is John Northup. I'm from an organization called WebAIM. We're out of Utah State University at the Center for Disability there. I'm actually a director of evaluations, so my team evaluates websites for customers and provides reports describing barriers we find and how to overcome them. And we've been doing this for about 23 years, since 1999, when the first edition of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines first came out. We've been providing this kind of consulting and training and different services to folks needing help with accessibility. So that's just a little bit about me. I'd like to get to know you better. Accessibility touches a lot of different roles. So what are the different roles we have here? Who are the developers in here? Who are the code jockeys in here? I see a few hands coming up. How about designers, visual people? I see some more hands coming up. How about authors, content creators? I know one hand's gonna come up, yep, at least one. And how about QAs, evaluators? I see more hands coming up. And are there other roles that I haven't covered today that people have?
Project manager.
Project manager, great. So accessibility touches all of these roles. If you're a developer, the code you create creates structure and semantics that impact accessibility. If you're a designer, the visual experiences you create certainly have an impact on accessibility. As a content creator or author, the words you use, the complexity of the language, even the phrasing you use for links has an impact on accessibility. QAs, evaluators, you have to be able to look at all those things and determine whether they're conformant, user-friendly, etc. As a project manager, again, you have to have that overall view to make sure that project is moving in an accessible direction. So it hits all of us in different ways, but how do we measure accessibility? Well, I mentioned the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which I'm going to pronounce as WCAG, kind of along the same pronunciation rules as NAGW, right? We kind of abbreviate it as best we can. Currently it's in version 2.1. There are new versions coming out, but that's where we are right now. And it's based on 4 different principles. There is perceivable. Basically, that content needs to be able to get into our senses. I have to be able to see it, or I have to be able to hear it, or if I'm on, say, a Braille reader, I need to be able to get it in my fingers. I need to get that content into my senses somehow. And then once it's there, then we deal with operable. Can I interact with that content? Can I fill out a form? Can I operate widgets that do things like open and close things, or launch dialogues, or submit forms? And then there's understandable. Does that content speak my language? And I don't mean like English, Spanish, French, but I mean, does it speak at a level that's relevant to me, that's going to help me interact with this content and get my job done that I want to do? And finally, robust. Can this content be adapted to various media, like laptop, maybe a larger display, maybe a phone, maybe something in between like an iPad? And what about future-proofing as much as we can that content? That's all in robust. So just to start off, if we can remember these 4 basic big concepts and apply that to the content that we're creating, we're really half the way there. Now we can drill down in there for some techniques. And we're going to do that in the hour that we have for us today. Also within WCAG, there are different guidelines, there are different success criteria, and they're organized into 3 levels of conformance. There's level A, which is pretty minimal. It's just the basics. I think of it more as kind of a stepping stone to something that's a little stronger. But a team that is starting to work on accessibility can prioritize the level A stuff first, and then that's a milestone. It's on the way to AA conformance, which is what most websites strive to achieve. And that's typically what's expected by users. In lawsuits or complaints, they'll typically reference the current version of WCAG at level AA as a conformance target. And then there are some AAA success criteria, and they are things that apply to some certain situations but wouldn't be needed on all websites. And so you might cherry pick a few AAA success criteria, but it's not necessary for most websites to strive for AAA. Not even the WCAG website itself is AAA conformant, because one of the requirements is that content be readable at a lower secondary reading level, and there's a lot of the WCAG language that is not. So those things are things you can cherry pick, kind of the icing on the cake. So what does this look like? If we go onto the WCAG website, they try to make it very organized. They try to take this nebulous concept of accessibility and break it down into check boxes that you can check off as much as possible. So within each principle, we have guidelines. Within each guideline, we have success criteria. Here we start out with perceivable. Right on top is text alternatives, guideline 1.1. Then within that guideline, we have success criterion 1.1.1, non-text content, which is about alternative text. And it goes on and on through the different principles, guidelines, success criteria, trying to bring some order, trying to kind of linearize this somewhat amorphous concept of accessibility. And I have a link up there. I can share these slides with anybody who wants it to. But this is pretty easy to find via Google anyway. Over at WebAIM, we've taken that and we've created our own kind of Cliff's Notes version of WCAG. We have our own little checklist. And this is, we don't mean to say that this is the official WCAG or a substitute. It's just short representations of the most common things that we would find in websites. And we put that out there as kind of a quick check to go down. And then if you'd like more information on the actual WCAG text, we link out to the true WCAG website there. We just put that out as an aid. I should add too, I love being interrupted. So if anybody has a question, just don't be shy. Raise a hand, and if I don't see your hand, just start talking, and that's fine. So I'm going to go through some quick checks that you can make on your website to check for some of the most impactful things for accessibility. Since WCAG starts with alternative text, let's begin there. Alternative text is what's conveyed to a screen reader in place of an image. Now, if you don't know, a screen reader is software that announces web content orally for folks who are blind, for folks who just want to hear content at the same time they see it. But it will go through that web content so you can hear it as well as see it, or hear it in addition to seeing it. So instead of an image, I would hear the alternative text for the image, which is the alt attribute on that image. If images don't load for some reason, then the alternative text will also be presented visually, because sometimes the image is broken, sometimes the user turns off images, who knows? There may be a case where they just don't come up. Search engines also tie into them. I'm not going to pretend to be an SEO expert, but I do know that alternative text on images, it doesn't rank quite as strongly as true text on a page, but it does rank into that equation. So how do we test our alternative text? It needs to be equivalent, and that might sound kind of obvious, but it needs to represent the image. Basically, if the image weren't there, what would we need to convey to users in place of that image? Some things that aren't equivalent, sometimes I'll see like a photo credit as alternative text, but that photo credit is nowhere else on the page, and somebody decided, well, I'll just bury it in the alt attribute, and that way it's there in the code. But that's not telling me what the image is. That's just some extra information that's there. It should be succinct, basically the granularity of a news headline. It shouldn't just be sentence after sentence. If you need that much alternative text, there are alternate ways to present that content. It shouldn't be redundant. For instance, if I have a portrait of someone and then their name is visible text underneath that picture, I probably won't need to put alternative text with that name on the picture, unless the picture is linked by itself. And then that alternative text would serve as the text for the link, so I would need it then. But it generally doesn't need to repeat something that's visible in the page. Also, you don't need to say image of, or picture of, or graphic of, because screen readers announce graphic anyway. And so that isn't like a failure, but it's redundant. So, because the screen reader would announce graphic of, image of, whatever. So don't need to add that. Yes, sir?
So if the image is a link, like if it's wrapped in an anchor tag, I've seen some people say, you know, they'll describe the image, then they'll say, this goes to page whatever. Is that, do we not need to do that?
Well, it kind of depends on the context, because you do need to tell people where that link is going to go. Actually, that brings up my next slide. Here's the logo from our WebAIM website. And this is up in the upper left corner, and this is linked to our home page. Now, for us, we decided that our alternative text is WebAIM, web accessibility in mind, because that's the text in the image. Now, we don't say that this is a link to our home page, because we figure that the position on the page, it's the first, well, almost the first link in the page. We figure that's going to be descriptive enough. If a user hears WebAIM, web accessibility in mind link, we feel that conveys that that's going to go to the home page, because we didn't specify anything else. Now, would it be a failure to put home page on that alternative text? Absolutely not. It's kind of a judgment call. Some of this is subjective too. Actually, a lot of this is subjective, especially alternative text. Did that answer your question, or point to it anyway? Okay.
I've got a quick question.
Yes, sir.
So on the previous page, you said that, okay, let's say you have a headshot of CIO, whoever. It's got a caption below it that has their name. You say, okay, don't be redundant, so don't put their name on there. What do you put on there if it's not, okay, image of our?
That's a great question. What we would do is alt equals quote, quote. We wouldn't recommend omitting the alt attribute, because then it's ambiguous. Then nobody knows that maybe the alternative text just wasn't thought of, or if somebody thinks it's not important. So alt equals quote, quote expresses that there doesn't need to be alt text on that image, unless that image by itself is a link. Now, if we're linking to like a biography of this person, I'd recommend wrapping the image and the text in one link, but sometimes we see just the image as a link. And then we need alt text, or else there's no definitive way to tell where the link goes. All right, so that's alternative text. You can check that, make sure that the alt text is appropriate. Sometimes I see file names as alt text, and that's just probably not going to be helpful to anybody. So that's one thing to look for. Something else is contrast. This goes back to the perceivable principle, where we need content to be visually apparent. So here we're not talking about the screen reader experience, we're talking about the visual experience. And we have a fine formula here that calculates a ratio. And don't bother to copy this down. We have a contrast calculator on our website, and there are a lot of them out there that will calculate the ratio for you. Basically, if there is no difference in contrast, then it's 1:1. Black on white, which is the strongest, is 21:1. So we're going to be somewhere in that range. What is passing at WCAG level AA is 4.5:1 for normal size text, and 3:1 for what it calls large text. It expresses largeness in points, which I don't think any of us are using in our CSS, but if it is greater than or equal to 18 point, or it is bold and greater than or equal to 14 point, then we can get away with just 3:1 contrast. And I know the designers in the room are probably going to bristle a little bit, like we're intruding on creativity, but remember, we're going from 1 to 21, so just requiring 4.5 or even 3:1, that leaves a lot of options open. I don't think that should be too constricting. And we translate this to pixels here, 18 point being 24 pixels and 14 point being 18 2/3 pixels. We have some examples of conformant color combinations. These are not design suggestions, by the way. These are just color combinations that happen to be conformant. So this is just a starting place, certainly not where you need to end up. This purple on white is just about exactly 4.5 to 1. Red on yellow, it's a little dark red, it's not pure red, that's 4.5 to 1. A little bit of trivia for you, the lightest shade of gray that's conformant on a white background is this hex 767676. A lot of times we'll see hex 777 and it's just that much out of conformance. But again, those are just places to start. So that's something that you can check. And there are various tools that will measure contrast on your site. We have one of them. I'm going to demonstrate that in a bit. But developer tools in Chrome will measure contrast and tell you whether your contrast is conformant. It'll be able to tell whether it qualifies as large text. So there are many ways to do this. If you have text on an image, you can eyedropper that area of the image that the text is on top of and determine it that way. Kind of following on to the color conversation, what about color blindness? Here we have an image of a red shirt that says, I might be colorblind, but I know I look good in green, ha ha ha. Well, what can we do about color blindness? It impacts about 8% of men, maybe 0.1% of women, so somewhere around 4% of your user base total. And it depends very much on the user. There's red-green color blindness. I've heard of blue and gray color blindness. It varies in intensity. So how can we accommodate this very individualized difference in perception? Well, what we do, we don't say don't use color, right? What we say is don't rely on color. Don't say, oh, click the green button for yes and the red button for no. Instead, there has to be something else in addition to the color or instead of the color that conveys that meaning. Another place where color reliance comes in is if our links are not underlined. That became fashionable a while ago to remove the underlines from links. I think some designers felt that it just looked smoother not to have the underline, and I can respect that. But then we are depending on color to differentiate links from the body text around it. And when we do that, that's okay, but we need enough difference in color between the link text and the body text so that a user can tell the difference, and that's a 3-to-1 contrast ratio. I'm just talking about body text links here. I'm talking about, like a Wikipedia page where every third word is a link to another Wikipedia page, that kind of thing. If you have, say, a main navigation up at the top that's it's visually obviously links, you don't need to underline everything. And again, this is just visual. In the screen reader, every link will be identified as a link, whether it has an underline or not. So this is just all about the visual experience. Any questions so far? I know I just go and go and go, so feel free to chime in. All right, we'll keep going. Something else we can do for perceivability is be aware that users are going to zoom our content. Zooming content in a browser is really, really easy to do. It's Control and plus to go in, Control and minus to go out, Control 0 to go to 100%. Of course, on the Mac side, it's Command instead of Control. And what this will do is introduce the responsive breakpoints even into a full-size display. And this is key to bear in mind. Sometimes users are going to be interacting with your responsive layout when they're on a full-size display. It's not all about touch. They're going to be keyboarding around, they're going to be mouse clicking around, but they're going to be interacting with something that we might be thinking of as just being used on a phone or a tablet. And so what you want to be sure of is that your layout doesn't break on a full-size display when a user zooms in. Up to 400% is what WCAG specifies. And that's from a starting browser width of 1280 pixels. So basically, WCAG mandates responsive design, which we're probably all doing anyway. So just good to know that that also benefits accessibility. Going back to screen readers just a bit, as I said, not everybody who uses a screen reader is completely blind. We do a survey of low vision users and also blind users, but low vision users, and 45% of those in our most recent survey tell us that they use a screen reader even though they have some vision. Some low vision conditions may be helped by being able to hear the content in addition to seeing it, just because of various low vision conditions. I had one colleague who couldn't see what was directly in front. He only had peripheral vision. And of course, there's also conditions where the periphery is cut off and a user might have kind of tunnel vision. And of course, in that case, zooming doesn't help, right? Zooming would just take more of that content and put it out of the field of view. So a screen reader helps. Some users, because of cognitive disabilities or reading disabilities, may just be helped by hearing content in addition to seeing it. So what can we do, aside from the things that we've talked about so far, to optimize content for screen reader users? It's all about the structure and the semantics. So you'll want to check those things as well. The structure, meaning it isn't just a bunch of text thrown on a page, right? There are headings, there are regions, and we'll get into those in just a bit. And semantics. It's more than just plain text. It's a text that also has the semantic value of being a heading or has the semantic value of being within a table. It doesn't just look like a table, it is within a table. It doesn't just look like a heading, it is a heading. And I'll dive into headings now. Screen reader users tell it. Was that a hand going up, sir?
No.
Just a scratch and an itch.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Want to be sure I catch everybody. Headings. When screen reader users go into a page, they tell us that headings are the way that they navigate around the page. Think about it. When I get into a page as a visual user, I do not go and read every word on that page, top to bottom, looking for something I might be interested in. My eye goes from region to region, from heading to heading to heading, those chunks of big bold text, and then, oh, that's interesting, I'm going to start reading down there. Screen reader users do the same thing. They can hop from region to region, they can hop from heading to heading, jumping over the content in between, and then when something interests them, then they can read down the body text from there. So headings are key. They need to describe a section of content. It can't just be, well, here's a big tagline that we want everybody to see and appreciate, so we're going to turn that into a heading. That wouldn't be a heading. That's just big, bold text. A heading implies that there's some related content down below. So most pages should have one H1 heading. They go from H1 to H6. H1 describes the page. It's not for branding, because that wouldn't change from page to page. That would be the same. The H1 is about, what is this page? So look for that on your pages. Do you have an H1 that describes the page? Or is it missing? Or is it kind of the same from page to page? You want that H1 to describe the page and ideally be up at the top of the main content area. And don't skip ahead. Headings are kind of like a term paper outline where you have a main idea and then a topic and then a subtopic and maybe a subtopic. They kind of step in. So that H1 is the main idea of this page. But we wouldn't go from a main idea to a subtopic, right? There's something missing in between there. So that's why we recommend not skipping ahead from like an H2 to an H4. Keep that nesting appropriate. It's all about the parent-child relationship of the content. It's not about how important something is. It's just about what relates to the heading above it. Now you might find yourself skipping backward, and that's okay. You go into a topic, you get down into the details, and now it's time for a new topic. So you're back out, maybe you're out down in H4 or H5, now you're back out to H2, starting another topic. That's fine. Again, same rules as for an outline.
I have a question on that actually.
Yes, sir.
So I've been told that going from like, say you have an H2, and then you have 3 H3s below that, and then you go back to an H2, then that's a no-no?
No, that's fine.
Okay. We had an
Yeah.
accessibility expert that told us that screen readers aren't able to gauge that if you go from one heading size back up to a larger one in the middle of your text.
Well, if I'm using, it depends on what shortcuts I'm using. Like I use NVDA for a screen reader, and for me it's the H key that goes from heading to heading to heading. That will not tell the difference between headings, but I can also use the number keys to I can use the 2 key to go among all the heading 2s, or the 3 key to go among all the heading 3s. And the heading levels are conveyed in screen readers. So I think if it makes sense to the content, then yeah, you could have H2, here's a list of all of our parks, and H3 is this park with a description, and another H3 is another park with a description. And then you have a few parks that are H3s, then you go back out to H2s, and what else is there? What other service do we have in the city?
Recreation center.
Right, we have recreation centers, and then we're gonna have H3s describing those. If the content nesting makes sense, then I think I don't see a problem with that.
Okay.
But maybe there's some circumstance specific to a page that I'm not.
Yeah, it was just one person's expertise, so.
Okay.
I always have
Okay.
preferred to nest like that, so.
Okay. So we talked about headings. Stepping out from headings, we have regions that I've mentioned just a bit. Screen reader users, if we use these regions, screen reader users can hop among the regions. The header, generally up at the top of the page, containing the branding, containing maybe a tagline, maybe a search mechanism, the main navigation. The nav region is the main navigation on the page. Sometimes there might be a secondary navigation, but usually just one nav or maybe a couple per page. You don't need a nav region around every link all over the page, or that makes it hard for the screen reader user to find what's the main navigation, which is probably what they're going to be looking for if they look for a nav region. The main region, the meat of the sandwich, this is the stuff that changes from page to page. A side, maybe some sidebar content, something that's ancillary to the main content, related but can still kind of stand on its own. And then of course down at the bottom we have the footer with some contact information and the accessibility statement and the privacy policy and terms and conditions and all that jazz. The nice thing about regions is, let's say I go to a page and the first thing I want to know about is the privacy policy, and I figure that's probably going to be linked down in the footer. So I can jump right to the footer. I don't even have to go heading. I can go right down to the bottom because I know that's where what I want is going to be located. And so that's something else you can check. Check to make sure that there are regions on your pages. Check to make sure that there are headings. Make sure that everything that should be a heading is a heading. Make sure that anything that shouldn't be a heading is not. And when I say make sure everything that should be a heading is, sometimes we have just big, bold text that functions visually as a heading, but it doesn't have one of these heading tags attached to it. So, okay, it's fine for visual users, but a screen reader user isn't going to be able to jump to it. Similarly, for regions, we might have, say, a div with an ID of header, but that doesn't make it a header. That just means, well, it hooks into some CSS for the header. But we need to have these regions, or there are role attributes that correspond to the regions too, that accomplish essentially the same thing.
Question.
Yes, sir.
So are those div tags then? Or
They are not. These are just, well, they function like div tags, but these are tags unto themselves. Like header is a tag, nav is a tag.
Okay.
It's a container tag. Or you can have, let's see, like div role equals navigation instead of nav. I can send you the equivalencies there.
I mean, is there like because not everybody might not use div header or div main, they might use something a little bit different. Is there something you could put in a CSS file that will tell a screen reader that this is what we're calling our main region or something like that?
Well, no, not in CSS. You can have a role attribute on a div that conveys this same semantic value. And I can get you a list of those. They don't match these words, unfortunately. Like, instead of a footer, would be div role equals content info. I'm not sure why they're different, but they just kind of are. But no, that's nothing we can do with CSS, unfortunately. So let's explore, how does all this translate to a screen reader? Here's a screen grab of the WebAIM homepage. And as a visual user, I infer a lot about the structure and the semantics of this page. I know that WebAIM, Web Accessibility in Mind, is the logo. I figure it's probably linked because logos up there in the upper left always are. I can tell visually that we have a main navigation up in the upper right. I can tell visually that we have a big primary heading. I can tell visually that we have a search field. I can tell visually that we have other smaller headings down the page. I can tell some things are clickable because they're underlined. Other things look clickable because they're a different color and they're differentiated enough from the surrounding text. I can get all that just by looking. To convey this to a screen reader user, we are going to put all of this in the code as well. This is just all vanilla HTML, by the way, too. And so if we use heading tags, then I'll be able to hear in the screen reader that, say, we have web accessibility in mind is the primary heading for the page, and accessibility training is both a secondary heading and a link. I'll be able to hear that I'm in the header region or the navigation region, or that I'm on the search, or that I'm in the main content area. I get all of that information. When I'm in the list, I'll be able to hear that under this community heading is a list of 4 items, and then each item is a link. This doesn't require any JavaScript trickery or anything extra in CSS. It's just a matter of using HTML out of the box. And if we have time, we can do a bit of a screen reader demo later and hear how this sounds. Has anybody in here used a screen reader? Okay, I see a few hands, but this might be new to some folks too. So the one I use is called NVDA, Non-Visual Desktop Assistant is what it stands for. It really doesn't mean much, but it's a free screen reader for Windows. On the Mac side, you have VoiceOver built in. So this does not require an investment just to step into the screen reader experience. There's also JAWS, which is about $1,000 a license, but I tend to go with free stuff. Something else about semantics. There's sometimes some confusion over whether something should be a link or a button. And basically, links go places, buttons do things. Sometimes I see links used that really should be buttons. Rarely I'll see a button instead of a link, but when a screen reader user hears that they're on a link, they understand that they are going to be navigating to another page or navigating to an anchor link on the current page. It's about going somewhere, not performing an action. When they hear that they're on a button, yes, sir?
Are you just referring to HTML button,
Yes.
HTML or visual? Because a lot of times I'll make a link look like a button only because, like, stupid lights on.
And you know what? That's fine. That's fine. We're talking. That's okay. What happens in Little Rock stays in Little Rock. Don't leave this room. That's a good question. We're talking about the function. It's okay to make a link that looks like a button. And that's still a link. If it goes to another page, it's just a link that's styled with CSS. So when a user's on a button, they think, well, this is going to open a dialogue, or it's going to open or collapse a section of content, or perform some action, it's going to submit a form. Sometimes I'm asked, what about a button that submits a search? Because we might be navigating to a search results page as well as performing the function. It's a little bit of a gray area, but I would lean toward a button there because that trigger is really about the function, and the fact that it goes to another page is really kind of incidental. It could just as easily populate the current page with search results. So a lot of times I'll see a link that opens a dialog or a link that expands or collapses something, and those should really be buttons. So that's something else you can test for. You can inspect the code, you can listen to it in a screen reader, and there are differences in the ways that they operate that we'll get into in just a bit. Also on the topic of semantic and structure, tables. HTML, properly used, gives us very powerful tools for making tables accessible. It's all about the HTML structure. If I have a caption as the first child of my table tag, a screen reader user, when they come in, they're going to hear table, class schedule. So they'll immediately know what that table is for, what it's about. You could put a heading above a table, and then if I were navigating by heading, I would hear that heading, and then I'd go down to the table below. But if I were navigating to the table specifically, I'd hop over the heading and not hear that. Now, if you want the best of both worlds, you could make class schedule a heading within the caption. It could be caption, H2, class schedule, close the H2, close the caption. And this appears visually too. By default, it's centered above the table, but you can do whatever you want to it with CSS. And so that'll be conveyed to screen readers. Where we have header cells, sometimes we just make bold text in a data cell or make the background color different in a data cell, and that looks fine, but that isn't going to be conveyed to screen reader users as a header. So we need to use the TH tags, and to be really specific, we want to put scope on them. So for those header cells that go across the top of the table, we'll put scope equals col, meaning that they are column header cells. And for each row, typically there's going to be some data in the leftmost cell that applies across the row, and so we'll make those table header cells with scope of row. Now, just between you and me, if you have header cells on the top and down the left, and you tag them with TH and leave off scope, the screen reader will probably figure out that the cells on the top are for columns and the cells on the left side are for rows. That upper left cell might be a little bit ambiguous. The really big important thing here is to use the TH tags for headers. And what happens, this isn't just all kind of behind the scenes HTML perfectionism. What happens when we use header cells that way is we create these relationships in the table. So we have this caption of class schedule applies to the whole table. We have the header cells with the scope that apply to the columns and the rows. So as I'm cruising around this table with my screen reader, let's say I'm going across a row, I'll hear website development, I'll hear that it's a header cell. Let's say I go to the right, I'll hear course number, BIS 5650. I won't hear website development again because the technology knows that I know that I'm going across a row, and that to hear website development again would be redundant. Now if I go down, I'll hear database management, BIS 3330. I won't hear course number again because I'm navigating in a row. If these cells are all data cells, I won't hear any of them as I'm down in the data. I'll hear the content in the cell as if it were a data cell. But if I'm way down here on row 36 and column 14, I won't know what the header cells are that relate to the cell that I'm in. So really easy to fix with header cells. Any questions on tables? I know we're going through a lot quickly, but this is one of those tests that you can make, just inspecting the code, basically looking for those TH tags for the header cells and the caption, one thing that you can look for. Doesn't take a long time if you know what to look for. And getting into multimedia, where we have what WCAG calls time-based media or multimedia. Here we have an example of an audio file that tells us a story. And adjacent to that, let's say I can't hear the audio file. We have what's called an alternative for time-based media, or basically a transcript, where everything that is described in audio is available for me to read visually. Or I could listen to that in my screen reader if I preferred that to the narrator. I'm not sure I would want to do that, but it's available to do that. You know, it just gets out there in different ways. If I'm both deaf and blind, then I might be using a Braille reader, and I could interact with this text in my Braille reader, because that would allow me to go through at my own pace. The transcript can have a picture as long as there is alternative text. Here we have a little caption that, now that I look at it, looks like it's a contrast failure. Something to fix for next time. But there can be images in there as long as there's sufficient alternative text. And the nice thing about the transcript is it hits everybody. It allows me to just use that text in whatever technology, whatever device I want to. So it's, I mean, probably everybody with an asterisk, but it's as universal as we're going to get. Yes, sir?
About an alt text. Is it true that you can have a blank alt text if it has no bearing on the page?
Yes. If we just have some little frilly decoration or something that would be redundant alt text, we can put alt equals quote, quote for that. Here we have some battleships, and we presume that there's a heading up there that describes that this is about the Battle of Ushant. And I don't know, maybe alternative text would be appropriate here. Maybe given everything that's described down below, maybe there's nothing more that we could say about this image. Maybe we could call this decorative. But let's say I was looking at this slide and creating alternative text. These happy little geometric characters, they don't really add any information. They're kind of fun to look at, but they're probably decorative. I don't think I would need to say smiling red triangle and smiling turquoise pentagon. I think I would just say alt equals quote, quote for those. So use your judgment there. Yes, sir.
And so in doing that, that just eliminates the image from the screen reader?
Correct, correct.
Won't the alt equals quote, quote though get flagged by various tools that check to see if your page is compliant?
It shouldn't. What would be flagged is if there's no alt attribute at all. But alt equals quote, quote is just recognized as you, the designer, you, the developer, saying that there doesn't need to be alt text on this image, either because it's decorative, or the alt text would be redundant, or whatever reason in your judgment. And it can get kind of subjective. It can get subjective on the user side as well. When we poll our screen reader users for their preferences, some of them will tell us, look, I'm busy, I don't want to be bothered with the soft stuff. If there's a decorative image, don't bug me with it, just let me get in, get my job done, get on to the next thing I have to do today. Then there are other screen reader users who tell us, don't you filter my experience, don't you tell me that this image isn't important enough for me to know about. You're showing it to some people, I want to know about it too. And these are kind of the extremes, so sometimes we have to shoot for the middle. Sometimes brief but descriptive alt text is the way to find the middle there. So maybe battleships as a one-word alt text would be okay there. That wouldn't be wrong. Alt equals quote, quote wouldn't be wrong either. Gets a little subjective. This is why humans need to do this. We have some tools that can help us, but this is why humans need to make the judgment calls. Yes, sir.
Back on that other slide there again. Yes. Is there any kind of consideration given to being compliant in terms of like the white text with black background, and more kind of like best practice where it should be white background, black text for easy readability?
That's more of a usability question,
Okay.
which doesn't mean I'm dismissing it. It just means all accessibility cares about is that you're at least 4.5 to 1. Interestingly enough, there is no requirement, even at AAA, of having a certain font size. You can have a font that's so small you can't read it and be conformant, and I'm not sure why. I would think that's important to perceivability, but that's the way it is. So some of these things just rely on design judgment. So the contrast requirements, again, don't answer every design question. They're just the minimum. I mean, I would recommend don't use stark black and stark white, because on a display like I have here, it's the white's really bright, the black is just pure black. It's not like the old CRTs that I grew up with, where black was really kind of gray and white was kind of lighter gray. There's a lot of contrast there, and it can be jarring, so I'd recommend softening it out. Anyone else? Okay, I was going to mention too, for videos, having closed captions is very helpful. This is generally for users with hearing disabilities, but there can also be side benefits for all of us. If we're watching a video in an area that's noisy and we can't hear, if we have all of our senses, we can see the captions. And if we're in a very quiet area where we need to keep the volume down, we can see the captions, we can interact with it. So there are a lot of ways that closed captions help the general population as well as someone with a hearing disability. Yes?
So we've had some debates internally on captions. We get a lot of videos from board meetings and Zoom meetings, and a lot of go through YouTube and get auto captioned, which does an okay job. So we also use Happy Scribe, and we put the videos through there to make a better captioning experience. But legally, we weren't sure if there was any difference between a poorly done captioning job or an excellent done captioning job.
All WCAG says, that's a good question. All WCAG says is that you have to have captions. There's no quality requirement. Sometimes
we talked to county council and we get a gray answer, but
yeah, I would recommend, if you have the staff to do it, go through and audit those captions and make sure that there's nothing in there that's wrong. But even the lack of one comma can change the meaning of a sentence. So, and I don't think YouTube puts in any punctuation at all. It's just kind of one long stream. So, does Happy Scribe do that?
it's probably 50% better.
Wow.
So,
and I have not even heard of that tool.
Yeah.
So,
Is it a paid tool?
Yeah. But it does a great job, and because we don't have time to sit through a 2-hour meeting.
right.
But so we try to use that when we can, or for the more meetings that make it viewed more, we make sure we use Happy Scribe so it's cleaned up.
Right. Yeah, that sounds like a good way to go, but just from a strict technical conformance standpoint, there is no 90% or 98% or anything. So going into the operability principle that we talked about, one big thing about accessibility is making sure that a user who can't use a mouse can interact with everything on your site with just the keyboard. And this is something that you can test. Just unplug that mouse, take it away, and do everything on the page with the keyboard. And you kind of need to know how to do it, but there are only a few keystrokes that are really key to remember. You're going to be doing mostly, and this is not with a screen reader, this is just with a keyboard alone. To navigate between things that are focusable, like links and form inputs and buttons, you're going to be hitting the tab key, and that should stop at anything that is focusable, anything that is clickable. To go backward up the page, you'll be hitting Shift and Tab. To trigger a link, it's the Enter key. To trigger a button, and this is something that has the function of a button, doesn't matter what it looks like, but something that is in HTML a button, you'll be hitting Enter or the space bar. That's the user's choice. They both have to work there. To check a checkbox, it's the space bar. To navigate among options, like in a select menu or among a group of radio inputs, they are the arrow keys. To close something, the escape key. The space bar by default will scroll the page unless you're on something else where it has another meaning, like checking a checkbox or typing into a text field. When we build our own widgets, sometimes we build our own widgets that kind of look and behave like typical HTML elements, but are maybe styled to look a little more slick. When we do that, we have to make sure that these keystrokes are implemented, or else we're going to confound keyboard users. It can be tempting to sometimes build different methods of keyboard interaction for those widgets, but that can be frustrating because a keyboard user is going to encounter something that seems familiar, looks familiar, but doesn't operate the way that they expect it to. At the very worst, some of these widgets just don't account for keyboard operability at all. And it can get a little complicated. Like if we have a select menu, this is just a very vanilla HTML select menu. Here are all the things we can do with it with the keyboard. We navigate into it with the tab key. The space bar expands it. We can use the arrow keys to go up and down the options. We can hit a letter to skip ahead in the options to the option beginning with that letter. If we hit enter, that's going to select the option we're on and collapse the menu. If we hit escape, that's just going to collapse the menu. And if we hit tab while we're in here, that's just going to move to the next focusable element on the page. All of this is baked into HTML. We don't have to lift a finger to do this unless we build our own select menu. And I see a lot of kind of faux select menus cobbled together with lists and JavaScript, and it can work, but it can take a heavy lift and it can be a little bit messy. So what to test on your site when you have one of these selects, be sure that all these things work on it if it's not a true HTML select. Also on the topic of forms, we need to have labels. We need programmatically associated labels with all of our form fields. Here's an example of a text input. As a visual user, I see the words first name. It's right next to an input, so I make the association, yeah, I type my first name in there. If I can't see that, if I'm just on a screen reader and I tab into this input, I will hear that there's an input there, but I won't know what it's for. I'll have to jump out of the input and go exploring the text around and then hear, oh, I hear first name there right before this input, so this must be for my first name. To avoid that problem, we create this programmatic association. We have the label tag containing the text. It has this for attribute, and we can call this whatever we want. I called it fname for first name, and that corresponds to the ID attribute on the input. And as long as those two match, that creates the programmatic connection. So when I tab into this input, I'll hear first name editable. We don't have to program the screen reader to do that. Just the fact that these are associated will convey that label to the field. Now, if you want to test this, if you have a form with how many dozen inputs and you don't want to go listen to them all in a screen reader, a shortcut to see if these are connected is take your mouse and tap on the label. If focus goes to the form control, then this connection is there. So that goes for checkboxes too. You should be able to tap on the text and check or uncheck that checkbox. It's a real quick test. But if you do that tapping and then you don't find focus inside the form control, that means that this is just visually next to it and this connection needs to be made. And that goes for any kind of form control, select menus, text areas, button, input type equals button, checkboxes, any of that stuff. Now, where we have forms, we're probably going to have errors, and there's some guidance around error messaging too. Some of it just starts with usability. Tell the user that there's an error. Tell the user what the error is. I mean, I can't tell you how many forms I've been to, and I fat-fingered something and it said, oh, go back and check the form for errors. Come on, you can do better than that. At least tell me where it is. Don't play games with me here. I'm trying to fill out your form. I'm trying to go through your process. But beyond that, beyond informative error messaging, there are a few different methods for where to put them. If you have a short form with maybe just one or two things that could go wrong, one option is alert then focus, and I'll illustrate this in just a second. The second option is to put errors at the top, and that's helpful if your form could generate a lot of errors, something that's very complicated, where you cluster all the errors together above the form on refresh. And then the third option is inline errors, where the errors appear adjacent to each field that has an error. So alert then focus, this can be as simple as a very vanilla JavaScript alert. Now, I've left off my first name. I've actually left off all three fields here, but it's just going to alert me to first name is required, hit the OK button, and when I do that, then we'll need scripting to set focus to the field with the error, or the first field with the error in this case. Now, because this is kind of limiting, it's not good to have a whole bunch of errors in there, because as soon as I hit OK, this alert goes away, and so this is really best when there's maybe just one or two errors that could happen. For something more complicated, a longer form, you can cluster the errors at the top of the page. And here we have this div that gets put up above the form. We have a heading that says there's a problem with the form. Okay, what's the problem? We have a bulleted list, an unordered list, so I know, oh, it's a list of 2 items. I'll hear that in the screen reader, 2 items. And we have, please enter your name, please enter your email address, and it's, to be extra helpful, these error messages are linked to the fields where I need to go to fix the error. And so the presumption is that focus would be set to this div on page load, so that's the first thing I hear as soon as this appears, if I'm on a screen reader. Then inline errors, this can be helpful for users who zoom a page, or users with some certain cognitive learning disabilities who might find it easier to have the error information in context. You can put the error information adjacent to the field that has the error. So when the user submits the form, focus would be set to the first field that has the error, and then this text is associated to the input with an attribute called aria described by that I can go into detail one-on-one if anybody wants to know more about that. But that means when focus lands on an input with the text alongside it, the screen reader user will hear that text right along with the label. They won't have to go fishing around for it. Now I'm talking about, oh, this is helpful for users who zoom, and this is helpful for other users. How do you know what kind of user you have? Well, you don't really. So I think sometimes it could be helpful to have both inline errors and errors at the top, where you might have a simple description of the error there in the top, and then you also have that description adjacent to the field. It's a little redundant, but I think it reaches out to users in different ways and can be helpful. And oh my gosh, the hour has gone by already. We have a tool out there called Wave. This is a free tool, and you run this on a page, and it will pepper a page with icons that show you errors on the page, alerts, things that might be errors. It'll show you the accessibility features. It'll show you where all the headings are, and you know that might be an error and it might not. It just tells you this is what it is. It'll show you where all the lists are, and I can demo that over lunch if anybody wants to hear me go on and on even more about accessibility. can also reach out to me, john@webaim.org. My team does all kinds of consulting about accessibility. The only thing we don't do is fix problems for you because we're all about education. So, are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Quick form question. So, do you have any suggestions or experience when using CAPTCHA? So the form I have on my website, the parts document control is
Right.
compliant. But then when using CAPTCHA, it flags it because I guess they're not doing the labels correctly or something like that. I can't get to it.
Yeah, CAPTCHA's difficult. The one we recommend is the one that operates behind the scenes without any human involvement. But then if CAPTCHA sniffs a problem, it'll give you this, oh, click on all of the fire plugs kind of thing. So, yeah, CAPTCHA's tough.
Yeah, I haven't found a solution for it yet.
Anyone else? All right, folks. Again, reach out to me. I'm glad to send the slides to anybody who wants them, and I'm glad to keep talking over lunch if you'd like to do that. And thanks for attending.